Hello, nerds!
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 Hello, nerds.
Rita Bosworth, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure having you. We're going to get into your nonprofit sister project in a minute. Before we go there, just tell us a little bit more about your kind of life story before you got into the sister project.
Sure. Well, I was not involved in politics before the 2016 election. I'm actually a lawyer, and I was a federal public defender for 12 years in DC and San Francisco. And that's what I was doing in 2016 when, the election earthquake kind of shook our nation. And I live in California in the Bay Area, a very progressive area. And what really struck me in 2016, just as a citizen, was how Democrats are a majority of the country, but they don't have a majority of electoral power. And we feel that acutely in progressive areas, particularly in the beating heart of blue California, where, we saw Democrats win almost 3 million votes more than Republicans, yet they didn't win the White House. But it wasn't only that. They didn't win the Senate. They didn't win the House. They didn't have the courts. They didn't have the states. And so I just started thinking, why is this happening? And so it was really as an outsider, as somebody who hadn't been involved in politics, wasn't involved in kind of the back scenes, how the sausage is being made. I was just trying to think, why is this happening and how can we fix it? And so I came at this from the perspective of just a fairly well-informed, concerned citizen and trying to think what we can do about it. But my background is I've been a lawyer my entire career and practiced criminal defense. So that's where I was. But now here, 4 years later, here I am.
So are you doing it full time now, or is this in addition to is this kind of like a volunteer project for you?
No, I am doing it full time. And, I laugh now at my kind of naiveness, because back in 2016, I had this idea for Sister District Project, which I know we'll talk more about. And I think that somehow I thought I was just going to be able to build a website and put it out there and it would be self-executing, which of course is it's not how these things work. And organizing is very hard. It takes a lot of time and effort, and it's something you have to do full time if you're going to be successful. So I did end up leaving my job and my career in the summer of 2017, and I've been doing this full time ever since.
What was that transition like from attorney to nonprofit executive director?
It's hard to explain. I don't think I knew what was in store, or else, to be totally honest, I'm not sure I would have done it. And that's not to say that I'm not glad I did it. I am. I'm very glad I did it. But it's so much work. And, I am a lawyer, but not only that, I've worked for the federal government my entire career. And so it's a wonderful place to work. You can be doing public service, but you also have the benefits that you should have, that any worker should have. You have decent wages, time off, good health care, all those things. And so one of the biggest shocks, which is just kind of logistics, is you let go of that, and then suddenly you're thrust into the world of just where nothing is certain. And I'm very fortunate because my husband is a teacher and he has great health benefits and he has a steady job. And so I was able to take that leap. But that's something I thought about a lot, is that those folks who don't have that stability can't just drop everything and leave. I mean, you've got to support your family, right? Yeah. So that's one thing. And then I had young kids at the time. My twin boys were 2 in 2016 when the election happened. And so that was another wild card, so here I am leaving my career that I built up and my good job with these young kids, and of course all the expenses that go along with that. So it was jarring, and that's why I had never in my life thought it was something I would do. I don't consider myself an entrepreneur. I'm a really good lawyer, and I'm really good at solving problems and taking a task and figuring out how to get to the solution. I had never thought of myself as somebody who thinks outside the box, as an inventor, creates an organization. Really, that never occurred to me. And so when it became clear that was what needed to happen in order to get this off the ground, I took kind of a flying leap. And it was hard because I'd never been outside the government sector before. But I will say that it also really opened my eyes up to what else is out there and what's happening in this big, beautiful, sometimes ugly world. There's actually so much opportunity and so much space to do what you want to do and create. And so, it was very, very hard. I had to learn a lot of things on the fly, but it's also, I think, expanded my horizons a lot in terms of what's possible.
When you were in criminal defense, you probably have a very informed or unique perspective on all of the Black Lives Matter stuff, and then the conversation about institutional racism and fairness. Did you see that firsthand? Like, what's your take? Do you feel like we're making too big of a deal out of it, not enough of a big enough deal? Like, what do you think people are missing from a layman's perspective?
I mean, I think this is why I went into public defense, to be honest. I mean, I saw this decades ago, and not saying that I'm so great, but that's just what I became interested in and what I focused on. And that's why I went to law school, was to become a public defender, because I saw these inequalities and I saw what was happening in this very unfair, unjust criminal justice system. Public defenders, I would say, have been on the front lines for decades, and we haven't been quiet about it. I mean, we have been screaming about this for years. I spent over a decade in courtrooms, begging and pleading with judges and prosecutors and probation officers to understand the systemic inequalities in the system. That's all on the record. That wasn't a secret. You can go back and look at our court filings or listen to the hearings of our procedures. And what was so frustrating about being a public defender is that you would be speaking truth to power, which is one of the things I loved about that job. You could speak truth to power. My husband used to say that when I first met my husband, I told him I was a public defender, and I get paid by the government to fight the government. And he was like, "That is so punk rock." But it's true. It's one of the few jobs where you are getting paid by the government to tell the government what's wrong with it, and that's what you're supposed to do. So I loved that job. The problem is that the system is such that there's not a whole lot of leeway or incentive for anybody, judges, prosecutors, probation officers, to make it right. And they really just see this system as, well, this is the law and my job is to follow the law. And they really block out any of those arguments about policy or what the evidence tells us about what a criminal justice system should look like if you actually want to reduce crime. The social aspect of it, the racism, they cut that out. That's not considered. So yes, we have been on the front lines screaming this for many, many years. I am thrilled and kind of shocked that this is now becoming mainstream. And in a way, I'm so gratified that now people are really starting to pay attention. And you'll hear, public officials or even just normal people saying the things that we've been saying forever, which is great. But it also feels a little bit uncanny to think, why weren't you listening 20 years ago? This has been happening forever. So I am very, very glad it's now becoming something people are paying attention to. I certainly wish it had happened sooner. But no, I still don't think we're talking about it enough. I mean, this is a big, big problem. And I do worry that, it rode the wave and that we're going to forget about it. I certainly hope we don't, but it's a problem and we need to keep it on the front burner.
I've always been curious about public defenders because the perception or the conventional wisdom is that if you can afford a private attorney, you should absolutely get one. On the other hand, I'm talking to you and I'm like, well, if I needed help, Rita seems like a pretty put together person. Like, what's the story there in terms of kind of representation for defendants who can't afford an attorney? Is it like a staffing issue, or are a lot of people choosing not to go that route because it just doesn't pay? Or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's this is a social justice job. And so when you go to law school, there are always those folks that go to law school specifically because they want to do social justice work. And if you look over history, lawyers, I know people like to make fun of lawyers in movies and media and whatever, but lawyers are the ones that really have this skill set to make change. Look at Brown v. Board of Education. Like, you can bag on lawyers all you want, but if you become a lawyer and commit to social justice work, you actually can be really at the forefront of change. And those are the kinds of people that want to be public defenders. It's the people that understand that they have this unique skill set that can be used for good to kind of push the needle forward. And so, the attorneys I worked with at the Federal Public Defender's Office were some of the brightest in the country. And we are people that, yes, we pass up these very, very lucrative law firm jobs, but we do that with purpose and intention. That's not why we went to law school. And our entire mission is to make the system a little bit more fair, hold police and the government accountable, defend the Constitution. That's what we're doing kind of at our core, and to be on the front lines, helping these folks that literally everybody else in society ignores. Now, I will say there's also a little bit of a self-interested element to becoming a public defender because it's just a cool job. I mean, you get to be in court on day one. You're doing trials, a couple months out of law school. No other job, no other legal job lets you do that. So I was at age 25 doing trials by myself, lead counsel in federal district court. I had friends from law school who probably still haven't seen the inside of a courtroom. So it's a fun, cool, interesting job. And I am one that thinks people should do fun, cool, interesting jobs over jobs that, fill their bank accounts. I mean, for now, at least, that's how I've always looked at it. So it's, doing mission-driven work is really unparalleled. I don't think that there's anything as fulfilling as being able to have a job where you do good, but you also enjoy doing it. Now,
go ahead.
Sorry, just one more thing to your question about, this kind of bad rap that public defenders get. It's true. And it's unfortunate because there are so many public defenders across the country who are some of the best and brightest lawyers, and they're doing this because they believe in this cause. But, it's going to vary district by district, state by state. Some states and counties really fund their public defender programs, and you're going to get excellent attorneys. Some states don't even have a public defender program. And then, it's not going to be as good of representation. And that's why I think most people in the public defender world believe this is something we need to robustly fund, because otherwise you are going to end up with subpar representation. But I will say that, sometimes when I got a client, and the client would just, without even meeting their public defender, would go hire a private attorney. And that's fine. There are great private attorneys too. But, if you hire an outside private attorney who doesn't know the judges, doesn't know the prosecutors, doesn't know what a case is worth, it's actually not going to be to their benefit. But there is this perception that, well, public defenders are bad. And that's really not true.
Yeah. Did you feel like you had enough time to support each client? Like, I kind of have this impression like, oh, it must be like public schools where the teacher could be amazing, but if they have like 35 kids in the classroom, how can they do as good of a job as, if the ratio were different? Did you feel like there was enough time per client for you?
We're really lucky in the federal system that we are well resourced. And so at any given time, my caseload was probably between 35 and 50 clients. And the way we did it in my office in San Francisco and in DC was you get that client at the very beginning at the indictment stage, and then you carry that case all the way through the appeal. So you're going to have, the 35 to 50 cases, you could have a couple that are pretty small. They're just little probation violations. They're going to take a couple of court appearances. all the way to those cases that are going to go to trial or appeal. You're going to have a couple of those too. So it was always a very full caseload. You never were done, and you always could be doing more. But like I said, the federal defender offices, we tend to be fairly well resourced. Now that can vary dramatically, like I said, in state offices. And if you follow this stuff, you can see that there are, I think the New Orleans Public Defender Office is just notoriously has too many cases, to the point that they started filing lawsuits that they didn't have the resources they needed to constitutionally give adequate representation to their clients. And that's a problem in a lot of cases. And like you're saying, you could be the best lawyer on earth, but if you have 500 clients, how are you supposed to take care of all of them? So it's a combination, but I feel very fortunate that I was always in an office where I had a robust but reasonable caseload, and the resources to be able to fully defend my clients.
I think I missed a nuance there. You were a public defender for federal crimes. When I hear public defender, I think, okay, there's someone who, they get arrested on a drug crime or a drunk driving or something. Now, what kind of federal crime requires a public defender? Because I would imagine federal crimes are like big, organized crime or a corporation or something like that. Are there were you working with individuals, or was it entities? How did that work?
Well, you're not wrong in your presumption that you would think federal crimes would be these big, big criminals. Unfortunately, the federal government actually goes after a lot of little fish. And that's, one of the things that we really railed against. So, for example, over 50% of federal crimes, federal criminal prosecutions that are brought in a year are immigration crimes. Because for the feds, that's basically shooting fish in a barrel. It is a federal crime to illegally re-enter the country. It's basically a glorified trespassing charge. You aren't a citizen, you were previously deported, and you came back illegally. Boom. That is a federal crime, over 50%. And so what they do is I think something that really gets lost in the immigration conversation is how it's not that the feds are just circling, rounding up immigrants that don't have papers and deporting them. They round them up, then they charge them in federal court with a federal crime, and resources are expended during that litigation. Then they jail them. They can get up to 20 years in jail in federal prison for this essentially trespassing crime of illegal reentry. And it costs taxpayers, I think, $80,000 a year or something to incarcerate individuals. Then they deport them. I can't believe that's not more part of the conversation, because to me, that is it's almost a criminal misuse of resources, right? And that is the bread and butter for a lot of offices, especially in Texas, Arizona, Southern California, right on the border. They're just hundreds by the thousands. That's what's going through federal courts down there, because that's what gets their, like anything, the federal U.S. Attorney's Office, they've got their quotas, they've got their numbers, they've got to get their funding, right? And that's a really easy way for them to do it. So that's an example of something that was probably a third of my caseload when I was in San Francisco. But there's also drug crimes. The Controlled Substances Act is federal law. So, and by the way, marijuana is illegal federally. So it doesn't matter if you're in California, they could still bring a federal prosecution against you for possession of marijuana in federal court. Being a felon in possession of a gun is a federal crime. That's a pretty common one. Anybody who has literally just is in possession of a gun can be charged and incarcerated for up to 10 years. So yes, you do also have financial crimes, human trafficking, there aren't that many violent crimes in federal court. Most of those are adjudicated in the state. But, if there's any sort of violence against a federal official, wire fraud, mail fraud. But again, they do sometimes go after big fish, but it's much easier to go after small fish. It's much easier for them to get a conviction. And so you do end up with a lot of those. It takes more resources for them to prosecute a big white collar crime ring, where the other side is well resourced and has really good, really expensive lawyers that are just going to jam up the works. It's much easier for them to hit their numbers if they just go after these folks that don't have that defense network. So those cases do come to us, but I would say the majority of cases you're going to see that federal defenders are representing are just kind of these folks that get caught up in something.
We're going to get to the sister district in a second. Let me just ask you one more question, because as a former pre-law undergrad guy, I still am intrigued by the law and people who enter that profession. I was struck by your mention of the notion of federal law enforcement trying to hit numbers, because I guess I had this image of the Department of Justice as focusing on the largest crimes that kind of are most critical to address for the country, not hitting a bunch of, kind of nickel and dime trespassing charges. Tell me a little bit about that. Like, I always thought of the DOJ as like this independent kind of this institution that was above, kind of things like hitting numbers and getting budget and that kind of thing. Am I, it sounds like I might be a little bit too naive about that.
Well, again, that's going to vary depending on the priorities of the administration and the priorities of the Attorney General and the DOJ. I mean, we did see, I remember when Barack Obama was elected, of course, when there's a new president, new administration, they usually appoint new U.S. attorneys to, I think there's 92 districts around the country. And when that happens, they can come in and say, okay, we're going to shift priorities, this way or that way. And that happened a little bit when Barack Obama was elected. We experienced a little bit of a shift to, the U.S. attorney said she was going to go more towards white collar crime. But it wasn't that noticeable. And you've got all of these agencies that are working with the DOJ. So you've got ICE and you've got the FBI and you've got the CIA and they even work with local law enforcement. A lot of times local law enforcement will want to bring something in federal court. So they're kind of working cross-jurisdictionally. So it's not something that can be turned on and off like a spigot. And there are a lot of stakeholders for them to consider in terms of what they're going to prosecute. I've never been a prosecutor or worked at DOJ, so I don't specifically know if they've got quotas they have to hit. But what I do know is that they're going to, they're going to assess their metrics differently depending on what their supervisors want them to hit. And so if they've got administration or leadership that says we want numbers, we want quantity over quality, well, then there's a way to do that. And it's not to go after all of the sophisticated white collar criminals. Yeah,
that makes sense. I guess at the end of the day, these are human organizations, staffed with people that want to grow in their career. And if your supervisor is saying, hey, how many white collar crimes did we do this month? That's pretty clear signal that, okay, I should be spending more time on that type of thing. And maybe they're asking different questions depending on the administration's priorities. Well, let's talk about the Sister District project, Rita. Like, how does it work?
So as I kind of started talking about earlier, I after the 2016 election, I tried to figure out, why do we have this fundamental problem where a majority of Americans in this country are not represented by a majority of government? And that really is something that's stuck with me. I am a big fairness person. I think that's part of the reason why I was a public defender. And that just does not sit well with me. I think we'd be having a totally different conversation right now if the majority of the country was voting for Trump. Then we'd have a hearts and minds issue. We'd say, okay, we've got to go out there and we've got to sell our policies better, right? But we don't. We win on the policies, but it's just the electoral systems that are keeping us, holding us down. So I just was thinking, what can we do about this? And another thing I noticed was that a lot of people like me who live in these deep blue areas were really frustrated in 2016 because to a large extent, we've done what we need to do in terms of electing progressives in our backyard and voting and all the things they tell you to do in order to be civically engaged. But that's just not enough when you live in a really bright blue dot and you can't do anything outside of those boundaries. And so I just started thinking, well, what's an efficient way that we can use our resources here? And it occurred to me that we could organize people, particularly in these deep blue areas, and outsource or channel those resources to other parts of the country where a Democrat was in a competitive election against a Republican and needed some additional resources in order to get over the finish line. It was really a matter of saying, look, what's our strength? Well, we have the people, right? We are a majority. So let's take that majority and not just like, squander it on making blue districts bluer. Let's take the energy we have, put it elsewhere so we can actually bring balance back to the country. And it's really not an issue of trying to hoard power or seize power or game the system. It's really an issue of, hey, we're the majority. We should have a majority of power. Let's create that balance.
Yeah. What would you say to people who suggest that, well, wait a minute, like the reason we have these congressional districts is we don't want the most populated and resource rich districts to call the shots. So you should really stay out of, that Iowa or Wisconsin congressional race. That's not for someone in, whatever, Palo Alto to decide. How do you respond to that?
I think there's so many layers of nonsense to that argument that it's like hard to even know where to start. But and not that you're full of nonsense. I'm saying whoever makes that argument is full of nonsense. But okay, so I can start with 3 words, which is the Koch brothers. So anybody on the right who is saying that outsiders should stay out of politics, I mean, my gosh, they invented the concept of dark money. And so many races, so many of these conservatives running for office, they've got 6 to 10 donors, and they're all just rich people from wherever, versus all this grassroots energy that we see on the left. So anyways, that's one thing, is that this idea that outsiders should stay out, stay in their lane is ridiculous, because the Republicans invented that concept. And I think we need to be doing that as well. And another thing is this. So we focus only on state legislatures and sister districts. So what we do is we organize teams of volunteers, primarily in these deep blue areas. If you sign up on our website, you give us your zip code, we put you in a team with people in your community. And then we match you with competitive state legislative races elsewhere in the country where the Democratic candidate is in a competitive race and they need help. And we match you. That's why we're called the Sister District Project. People think it's because we're women run and women founded, which we are. But it's more this idea of sister cities where, your team in San Francisco is matched with a candidate in Arizona. And then they fundraise, knock on doors, make phone calls, write postcards, send text messages, all those things that every campaign needs in order to win. Now, getting back to your point about why is this okay? Well, let's take North Carolina, for example. North Carolina is a state that is so badly gerrymandered that Democrats have actually won a majority of votes, but they still can't get a majority of power in the state. Why should somebody in California care about that? Well, here's the thing. In 2016, North Carolina went for Trump by less than 50%. He got around 49%. That same year, they elected a Democratic governor by about 10,000 votes. So that's a state that is a purple state. That's what we call our quintessential swing state. But in 2016, 10 of their 13 congressional seats went to Republicans. And Republicans maintained almost a supermajority in their state house and state senate. How is that fair, right? You have majority of voters voting for a Democratic governor. The state went Democrat, and yet the Republicans have this stranglehold on power. Why does that matter in California? Well, because those 3 extra congressional seats that Republicans have because of the gerrymandering in their state, those Congress people are voting on federal legislation that affects us out in California. It affects us no matter where we are in the country. So that is why state legislative races actually become hugely important to the rest of us in the country, no matter where we live, because it actually is affecting us. We can't build a big blue wall around our state. We are going to be bound by federal legislation that comes down by these folks that are in Congress that really have no business being there, but they are because their state has gerrymandered their lines. Another example is what's happening in the courts. You have many, many states. I think there's 19 states where if Roe v. Wade is overturned, those states already have a law on the books that will outlaw abortion. Many states in the past few years have been bringing federal lawsuits to try to do things like outlaw abortion. Now, they're not bringing the lawsuit in Texas. They're not bringing the lawsuit just to affect the women in Texas. They're bringing that lawsuit specifically for the purpose of working it all the way up to the Supreme Court, specifically for the purpose of outlawing abortion for everybody in the entire country. So for anybody, particularly Republicans, to claim that outsiders coming in and being involved in their elections is inappropriate, it's actually just the opposite, because what they are doing purposefully is they're trying to shape policy for all of us. And so we have the absolute right to have a voice in that process.
Very compelling, Rita. Very compelling. What's working? I mean, is it working? Are you able to influence or maybe provide impactful help to candidates in state legislatures from so far away?
We are, and it's been incredible. So our first election cycle was in 2017. And, of course, 2017 was just post a presidential year. So there weren't that many elections happening. But we do state legislative races only, and there are always state legislative elections happening no matter what year, which is one upside of working in states. And in 2017, the big state that was having elections was Virginia. Now, Virginia is another one of those states that just kind of blows your mind what happened because of Republican gerrymandering. But in 2016, Virginia had a Democratic governor, 2 Democratic senators. They'd gone for Hillary Clinton by 5 points. They'd gone for Barack Obama in 2008. They'd gone for Barack Obama in 2012. This should be a blue state, right? Mm-hmm. But in 2016, Republicans controlled 66 out of 100 seats in their House delegates, and they controlled the Senate. Why is this happening? It's because of gerrymandering. And if your viewers don't know what gerrymandering is, I encourage you just to Google gerrymandering. If you Google gerrymandering Washington Post, there's a great image that shows you what it is. But it's the process of drawing voting district lines to favor a political party. And you can draw those voting district lines in a way that actually puts the minority party in power. And that's what happened in Virginia. So 2017, we come to Virginia. This is a state that should be a blue state, but Republicans have drawn the lines to really keep themselves in power. And once they're in power, they can keep making laws to make it harder to get them out of power. So the only way to overcome it really is just with an absolute, blue wave at the polls. And so we supported 13 candidates in Virginia. Perfect. We supported 13 candidates in Virginia, and that year we had great success. All but one of our candidates won, and we got the Virginia House of Delegates up to 49 Democrats out of 100. We almost got to 50. And if anybody was following this, you know that 50th seat was a woman named Shelley Simons. She actually tied. She didn't lose. She tied. And they drew a name out of a bowl, and it wasn't her name. So if anybody ever tries to tell you that one vote or your vote doesn't count, you think of the story of Shelley Simons. If she would have won one more vote, she would have not only won the seat, she would have flipped the entire chamber blue for Democrats in Virginia. That's how important one vote was. But anyways, and so we did have this great success in 2017. And then we were able to go back to Virginia in 2019, and we flipped the House and we flipped the Senate. And now Virginia is the first Democratic trifecta state in the South. And I will tell you that the first time their Democratic legislature met was this year in January of 2020, from January to March. In just that period of time, they got more done than I think Congress has gotten done in 4 years. They made Election Day a holiday. They got rid of restrictive abortion regulations. They enacted reasonable gun safety regulations. They got rid of Lee Jackson Day, which was actually a state holiday in Virginia. They did so much. They passed the ERA. They did so much in that period of time. And that is why I'm so obsessed with states, because in a time where Congress is toxic and hostile and hyper-partisan, and it's nearly impossible to get anything done. And I say that even knowing that Democrats have a shot at winning the Senate and the presidency this year. Of course, I want that to happen. Of course, that would be great. But it's just not as easy to move things through Congress quickly. There are so many competing interests. But when you're doing this in a state, you can actually do it very fast. And it turns out in so many states, these holdover Republican majorities from the gerrymandering, the partisan gerrymandering that they've done, are the only thing that is blocking progress from happening. And by the way, progress that the people in the communities in the state really want. And so it's just incredibly gratifying to be able to see that tangible progress that's being made. And, look, we didn't do it in 2017, but then we did it in 2019. And that's another thing to keep in mind, is that the situation we're in right now, where Republicans control so much of the power, even though they are a minority of voters, that did not happen overnight. They've been planning this for decades. And if anybody was paying attention to states in 2010, I mean, that was really a nail in the coffin for us, because we had just won. Barack Obama had just won in 2008. I think a lot of people on the left thought, well, great, we're done. Like, progress is inevitable. Post-racial America, here we come.
Post-partisan.
Yeah. But what Republicans were thinking was, well, 2010 is a census year. And the place where we can make a lot of impact is if we win power in the states. And they did. Those midterms were a bloodbath, not just for Congress and the Senate, but for the states in particular. And 2010 was a really important year because that was the census year, which means that the next year was when all the states underwent redistricting, which is drawing the voting district lines. And those districts stay in place for the next 10 years until the next census. So those are the voting districts that we're still living with today, which is part of the problem. The great news about 2020 is that it's another census year, which means that next year we're going to redraw those voting district lines. And so whoever wins power in the states this year in 2020 is going to have a seat at the table in drawing those voting district lines for the next decade. And that is the key. I mean, that is really the key to expanding progressive power and combating whatever we're going to see coming down from the federal level, whether that's the Republicans maintaining control of the Senate, or whether we're talking about the 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court, which I have no doubt is going to start just like slashing constitutional rights right and left. The best way we can protect against that is to win Democratic majorities in state legislatures so that we can build kind of a wall, protect ourselves against what's coming down, and also at the same time move progressive policy forward.
What's the best way to do that? Is it making sure progressive candidates for state legislature have sufficient funding? Is it volunteer bandwidth to do canvassing? Is it staffing or research? Like what are you finding has the most impact?
I think funding is always going to be the answer until we're able to get money out of politics in this country, but that certainly is very important. The nice thing about state legislative candidates, though, is that they have much smaller budgets than, say, a Senate candidate or a presidential candidate. And so your donation, even of $20, $50, can really make a difference in a state leg race that's maybe their budget is $200,000 or $300,000. And Sister District has a really great track record of being able to raise a significant portion of our candidates' budgets because they are so much smaller. So money is always going to be important, and especially early money, because the way it works is they've got these reporting deadlines, and a lot of times if they can raise money early and people can see, hey, this candidate's they're worth something because they're able to attract donations, then that's going to attract more donations, and that's going to attract party support. And that may even spook off a Republican opponent from running. So early money is one of the most important things I think that you can do to help elevate state legislative candidates and their chances. But yeah, also field. I mean, they all need field support. Every campaign relies on volunteers. It's been especially hard during the pandemic because, especially for these less known state legislative down ballot candidates, they rely on being able to go door to door and meet their constituents or have town halls because they don't have the name recognition as those big federal candidates. So that's a real blow to these down ballot candidates. But the nice thing is that Sister District is perfectly positioned to be helping these candidates during the pandemic because the majority of what we do is remote capacity. Mm-hmm. You live in San Francisco, you can make phone calls from your couch for your candidate in North Carolina or Arizona or Texas or wherever they are. You can send text messages, you can write postcards, you can fundraise, you can donate, you can do all of that no matter where you are in the country. And if you're doing those things, then that frees up the campaign and the campaign staff on the ground to be knocking on doors or whatever it is that they need to be doing locally. So again, this goes back to my original idea of determining what our resources and strengths are and how can we more efficiently deploy those in order to bring some success to our party.
Rita, one of the things I noticed on the sister district website was discussion of candidate selection. And I was curious, are you finding sufficient credible candidates running? A lot of people who are quite capable may not be as they may not think of the common good as much as you did when you went into public defense. And they might be working hard and they're trying to take care of their family. And the idea of joining the state legislature seems very foreign and unattractive. Do you find that there's enough people, it's really just getting resources to them, or do you also see some need to try and recruit people?
That's a great point. And so Sister District does not recruit candidates. That's not our mission. That's not what we do. There are organizations that do that, thankfully. And you know, just to underscore that point, I think one of the biggest problems Democrats had in the past few election cycles is that they wouldn't even run candidates. And so, you know, you'd have a situation, I think in Virginia in 2016, there were like 40 out of 100 districts where the Democrats didn't even run a candidate. And you certainly can't win if you don't run. So that the party is doing a really great job of addressing that problem. And, you know, if you run somebody in every district, even if you're not going to win, you're forcing Republicans to expend resources. You're forcing them to defend their positions. It's a good thing to do and to build up your goodwill in those communities. So that's not something we do, but that's definitely something that other folks are doing, and it is very, very necessary. And I think that you hit on something really important, which is that, yeah, this is tough. It's not easy to run and become a state legislator. And I think that's part of the reason why, unfortunately, we see our government generally stacked with rich white guys, because they're the ones that have the capacity and the resources to, you know, take the time that they need to not work and canvass. And, you know, none of that stuff is paid. If you want to run for office, you're doing that on your own time, on your own dime. And if you've got bills and kids and a job, it's much, much harder. So that's one of the things that we need to really reckon with in this country is if we want our government to look like our people, how are we going to make it easier for our people to run? What we like to, you know, what we want to do to contribute to solving that problem is we want to lift up candidates that represent voices that have not typically been heard in this country. And so when we select our candidates, we do start with the quantitative data. You know, we're looking at the states that we think there's opportunity to make strategic gains. And by that, I mean, we actually have 3 strategic buckets we're looking at. We look at states where we think we can flip a chamber blue, where we need to hold a chamber blue, or where we need to make inroads into badly gerrymandered chambers. And so we call those our blue flips, our blue holds, our blue inroads. And so we're looking at those 3 buckets. Within those buckets, we find the states that fit, and then we look into the districts and say, okay, quantitatively, which one of these districts do we think are right for a flip? But then we do an entire qualitative analysis on who are the candidates that are running. What are the people on the ground saying about the types of issues that they care about? Are the candidates going to address those issues? Are they going to be people that are going to speak up for their communities? And also one of the things we look at is this a diverse candidate? Is it somebody who is a person of color or a person of the LGBTQ community, women? Most of our candidates actually are women, because we really believe that it's not that there isn't talent out there, it's that it's hard to get in the door. And we want to be supporting folks to bust that door wide open, so it's no longer weird or even an issue if you're, you know, the first Latina woman to run in this district. We don't want that to be an issue because we want there to be so many of them that we don't even need to talk about it anymore. But we're far from that point. And in order to get to that point, we've got to lift up these voices.
Rita, why hasn't this come up and been a higher priority already? Like, I totally buy the argument that, hey, these state legislatures draw the district lines. They can do it to stack the deck in favor of whatever party that state legislature is in control, and that results in an unrepresentative district for the federal Congress. I buy the logic, but then why hasn't that been the battleground for the last 20 years if it's so crucial? It's sort of the fountainhead of where a lot of problems start. Why now? Like, why weren't we talking about this 10 years ago?
I wasn't involved in politics 10 years ago, so I don't know what.
I can't blame you.
I mean, trust me, I've asked myself that many times, because as I came to understand what was really happening, and again, for me, that happened back in 2016, after the 2016 election, when I really started reading about this. And I knew it was happening, but I didn't know the extent to which it just absolutely devastated the left. And I don't know. I don't know why this was not a bigger issue. I mean, I think that the Democrats, for some reason, kind of became obsessed with the national election, with the presidential election, and thinking that everything would just follow from there. And what they did not have their eyes on was that you cannot just focus on the national election, because then there is so much room at the bottom of the ballot to undermine whatever is, even if you win, to undermine what's happening. I mean, during Barack Obama's presidency, Democrats lost over, or I think around 900 state legislative seats. That's massive, not just because we lost the seats, but we lost the chambers, we lost the states. And like I said, those are now states that are controlled by Republicans. They now are passing laws and bringing litigation to challenge whatever's coming out of the federal government. You cannot pick one over the other. You have to be doing them all at the same time. I do not know why the party was not more focused on this back in 2010. They certainly should have been. But I do think that now they are, and now people know that this is happening. And that's been part of our mission, is to educate people and to make sure that when people get civically engaged, they're doing it in a way that is meaningful, which is what people want. I mean, people will volunteer. They will give you their time and their money, but they want it to mean something. They want it to have an impact. And that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to create an organization that had a clear, focused strategy that would actually create leverage for the party in a way that was accessible to anybody, no matter where you are and no matter how many resources you have. I think, it feels funny to donate to the presidential when you're like, well, I can give $50. What is that going to do? But if you can give $50 to a state leg candidate, and you can spend a couple hours phone banking in a race that's going to come down to 100 votes and is going to determine whether this chamber flips or not, that is highly impactful work that people can get behind.
What are your measurements for success as an organization? Like, how do you know that what you're doing is working?
That's a very good question. We think about this all the time. We think about it all the time. Are we having an impact? And we have several metrics. So number one, we are tracking all of our fundraising in field. So this year, we've raised over $1.85 million for our 40 candidates that we endorsed this year. I think that's an average of around 42,000. You could check my math. I'm sure you're more of a math nerd than I am. But that's a significant amount of budget for a state legislative race. So that's one thing. We're tracking our field. There are many campaigns for which we are sending all of their postcards. We are doing maybe 90 or 100% of their phone calls. And that's something that we're taking off their plate. We're doing it for free. We don't charge these campaigns anything, and we're freeing up their resources to work on other things that they need to work on. And then, of course, we're looking at our wins. I think right now we have about a 66% win rate. Now, we can't and don't try to take complete credit for any of these things. I mean, there are a lot of folks working from a lot of angles to help get these folks in office. But, there are races where our candidates have won by a handful of votes. And when we've got 30 folks out there canvassing pre-pandemic, knocking on doors, it's hard to argue that our addition, the value added by Sister District wasn't the thing that put that over the edge. And then we also are constantly surveying our stakeholders, our volunteers and our candidates. We consistently hear from our candidates that the support they get from Sister District is some of the most meaningful support they have in their campaigns. We consistently hear from volunteers that the work at Sister District is, what has saved them during the Trump years. And it's not that we're saviors. It's just that I really think that one of the antidotes to what Trump is doing and bad policy and kind of trying to make us all feel like what we do doesn't matter. I think the antidote to that is doing work that does matter. And I hear over and over from people that no matter what happens in 2020, I'm going to feel better than I felt in 2016 because I've been doing something that matters and makes a difference. And I think that's absolutely true. I mean, part of the entire MO of dictators and authoritarians is trying to make you feel like you don't matter and that what you do can't have an impact. And so why even bother? And we have to constantly push back against that because there's a real risk that we fall into that hole of despair thinking that, well, what's the point, right? And I think that's something Sister District provides for our volunteers is having the outlet to get involved in a way that's meaningful and continue having hope and feeling like what you're doing is going to make a difference.
I don't follow state races as closely as the national ones. Do you find that some of that polarization and kind of real animosity is kind of trickling down to the state races, or are state races kind of given a little bit more kind of, rational arguments, or is it still, are you seeing that polarization at the state level as well?
State races are so different than national races. You're not even usually talking about the same issues that they're talking about in the national race. The great thing about state races is you're talking about local issues that matter to voters. We supported a candidate in Virginia in 2017, Danica Rome, who ended up being the first transgender woman elected to the House of Delegates in Virginia. And it was a big deal that she was the first transgender woman elected to the House of Delegates. And her opponent was probably the most bigoted guy you could imagine. I mean, you couldn't write this in a Hollywood movie. He refused to debate her. He refused to call her a her. This guy was terrible. But she didn't talk about being transgender. She talked about traffic because that's what her constituents cared about. And she won. And when you're calling these folks in local districts about their state-led candidate, you get a much better reception than if you're calling about Trump or Biden, because they don't want to hear about that stuff. They see that as just, a lot of them just see that as noise, but they do care about who wants to fund education in their community and who's going to do something about potential climate change in their community. That's the stuff that matters. And that's the stuff that our candidates are talking about. It's not to say that these state races don't get nasty. I mean, the Republicans have a lot of, really racist people in state legislatures, to be totally frank, and they get away with it more because they're not in the national spotlight. But you will see egregious conduct and egregious ads from their side that, of course, we can't tolerate that. But for the most part, it's more civil because it's more focused on the issues that actually matter to the voters. And it's harder for Republicans to fool people in that respect because these are things that are touching voters.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. You can kind of audit their talking points a little more easily at the local level than Trump's healthcare plan is coming out in 2 weeks kind of thing. And, nobody sees it for 4 years. One thing I wanted to wrap with, Rita, is you started this organization partly out of concern for the outcome of the 16 race. As we're taping this now, there's an election coming up in a few days. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts? How do you think it's going to pan out?
It's such a dangerous question because I think everybody on our side is so afraid to say that we might actually win. I mean, I'm feeling cautiously optimistic about Joe Biden, but again, and you'll see that everything I say, I can tie back to the states. I mean, I think there's no doubt Democrats will win the popular vote by more than they did in 2016. The question really is what's going to happen in the courts. Republicans have gotten to the point where they know that they cannot win based on the numbers. They know that they cannot win if they follow the rules. And so they've really shifted their strategy to, number one, trying to keep people from voting. And number two, trying to litigate and challenge the results of elections. And so I do have a real concern that, that a lot of this is just going to be stuck in litigation, and it's going to depend on the integrity of those judges. And of course, we know that 25% of judges now have been appointed by Donald Trump. This was by design. So that's what concerns me still. But to tie this back to state legislatures, the first thing Republicans do when they take control of a state, the first thing, they make it harder to vote. That's number one. That's before they outlaw abortion. That's before they expand gun rights. They make it harder to vote. And think about what that means. It means they know they can't win if everybody votes. They've admitted that, right? So that's what concerns me. And I think that if we do win, that's something we need to take action on, because that's going to kind of determine the future. In terms of the Senate, I think there's, again, it's right on the precipice. I think we've got a shot, but it's just going to depend on how people are feeling. I don't know. I don't have any crystal ball here, but the other thing I will say is, and I hate saying it like this, but I actually kind of think it's true, is that Democrats have a lot of room to go up. And that's a nice way of saying that we're pretty close to rock bottom. We lost a lot of power, particularly in the states, over the past few election cycles. And Republicans, there are only so many votes. Even if you're suppressing the vote, even if you're gerrymandering the districts, at some point, there's only so much you can do. And so it's been said that massive turnout can overcome massive suppression. And I think there's no doubt that if Democrats voted in crazy record numbers all the time, we would win all the time. And I think that we are going to see progress this year, no matter what. We are going to see some chambers flip. That's going to happen. The question is just how many, where does it happen? And then where can we go from there? We didn't talk about this, but the Texas House is in play this year. And it's not just some, hopeful Democrats saying, oh, one day we'll get Texas. I mean, that actually could happen this year. Democrats only need to flip 9 seats in the Texas House in order to flip the chamber. And there are 9 seats that are currently held by a Republican that Beto O'Rourke won in 2018. So this legitimately could happen. And I can't even, almost after winning the presidency and the Senate, this is the thing I most want to happen, because that means that suddenly Democrats have a seat at the table for the next round of redistricting in Texas, which would be just monumentally, mind-blowingly amazing, because that's a very badly gerrymandered state. But think about the ramifications if Texas went for Biden. I mean, all of this nonsense that Trump is talking about, how he's not going to accept the results or they're going to litigate in Michigan, Pennsylvania, none of that would matter if Texas goes blue. So this is a wildly important state this year, and definitely something to watch that I'm kind of giddy about. Again, it's hard as a Democrat to actually think that something great might happen, but we've got a shot. So I think the key here is, if we keep seeing this massive turnout, if we keep seeing these record numbers, I think that really good things could happen. But I also always want to caveat this with, winning the election is just the first step. Winning the election doesn't change any laws or change any policies or appoint any judges. What we have to make sure we do is, no matter what, but especially if we win, we cannot stop being engaged, because this stuff doesn't make a difference unless we keep pushing our elected officials, keep holding them accountable, keep pushing for these progressive policies. That is when we're actually going to see the change. So I'm hopeful that we're going to accomplish the first step this week, but then we've got to double down and keep going even stronger.
Yeah, it is exciting what's going on in Texas. It's incredible. They're already beating 2016 turnout just with the early turnout. And there's certainly another almost 2 million, 1.8 million more registered voters this time around. So this could be a pretty exciting outcome. I mean, I would never have thought that Texas would be in play, but that's 2020 for you. Nothing is going as you would normally expect things to go. So maybe at some point that's to our advantage, and good things will happen.
I agree. My little joke to myself is that Texas has made this big deal about how they don't have regulations and they don't have taxes and everybody should move to Texas. And I actually know a lot of people that have moved to Texas, but I think one maybe unintended consequence for them is that Texas is becoming bluer. And you hope that that trend just continues.
Rita, how can people learn more, and what can people do who are listening to this and saying, hey, I really like this sister district thing. Like I want to participate. I want to pitch in. I want to get involved. What advice would you give them?
Go to our website, which is sisterdistrict.com, and you can click on the button to volunteer. And that doesn't obligate you to anything, but you will then get connected with your local team, like I talked about, and you'll start getting communications about what opportunities there are to get involved. We still have phone banks running, even for these last few days leading up to the election. And phone banking right now is the single best thing you can be doing to help on election day. It's the best way to be contacting voters. And so it's meaningful, it's impactful, it's something anybody can do. We have excellent training on phone banking. So if you sign up, you'll be trained by a professional who will tell you exactly how to do it. And then you make the calls, you can do it from your home. I would encourage everybody to do that. And at the very least, sign up with Sister Districts so you can get the information about what's happening now, our election results, and then what's the plan for after next week.
Let me ask you a tactical question about phone banking. I have noticed some congressional campaigns when they ask for help with phone banking, they're often at a structured, scheduled time. You kind of jump on a Zoom and then you kind of do it as a group, which I totally get. There are some times when I'm like, oh, I actually have 20 minutes free and I could help. But then I'm like, oh, well, the scheduled official phone banking thing is tomorrow at 8 p.m. and I've got to put the kids down or whatever. Do you find that are there people that do kind of like on-demand phone banking where I can just at my leisure make a few calls when I have time, or is there a reason why they're very kind of scheduled?
Well, part of the reason they're scheduled is because, of course, whoever you're reaching out to, there are optimum times of the day to be reaching them, and there are, of course, 4 time zones in this country.
Sure.
And so that I think is probably the main reason, is because they want to make sure people aren't getting calls in the middle of the night or early in the morning, or things like that you might not be thinking about, if you're just kind of doing it on your own. And then you also need the phone banks, the lists need to be refreshed, the messages need to be refreshed. So you really need to have somebody there who's managing the phone bank. And if there's any problems, you can reach out to them and let them know. And so you really do need to do it through one of these organized channels because of all of those little things that pop up. You need to have somebody monitoring it. And that's what we do. We have staff that is working with the candidates to make sure that our lists are up to date and the messaging is up to date, and to answer any problems while it's happening to make sure that it's as effective as possible.
Makes a ton of sense. Well, if anybody's interested to learn more, go ahead and check out sisterdistrict.com. And it's incredible work you're doing, Rita. I think it makes a ton of sense. And I kind of feel like the return on investment per hour and dollar in those state races maybe is a little bit undersold when people are thinking about, where do I want to spend my time and money? Because these congressional races are really tough to move the needle, and they take millions and millions of dollars per district. But if you could help impact the state legislature and fight the gerrymandering, and also get stuff done, see legislation pass, as well as train up the next generation of congressional representatives who, many of them come from the state legislature. Sounds like a great kind of like a Silicon Valley angel investing type approach where you could have a lot of impact and you don't have to write, massive checks.
Yeah. And, one other thing I didn't mention is that if you get out the vote for a state legislative candidate, those folks are also going to vote up the ballot. They're going to recognize the name at the top of the ticket. They're going to check that box for Biden. It doesn't always happen in reverse, because if they go to vote and they vote for president, but they don't recognize the names down at the bottom of the ballot, they're more likely to leave them blank. So, working for state leg races is not taking away anything from the presidential. It's actually adding to it, because you're making sure that you get out the vote for the president, but also all of those really crucial races down the ballot.
Makes sense. Well, with that, we'll have to have you come back again and give us an update as things progress. But for this conversation, we'll say goodbye, nerds.
Goodbye, nerds.
Okay, we are